Before we get started with the story, it's important to note that because Deadly Premonition leaves many questions unanswered and many important scenes occur off-screen, in order to assemble a coherent timeline, we've had to make some assumptions based on the best information available, as well as a few guesses based on what we know about the characters. Now, with no further ado, let's take a look at the story of Deadly Premonition.
While the game Deadly Premonition is set in the year 2006, the narrative seeds from which the story grows are planted half a century earlier. So we'll start there. In the early 1950s, Forrest Kaysen, an immortal demon posing as a pudgy, middle-aged man, works his way into the US Army's bioweapons program. He reveals to his superiors a chemical that he's developed based on a mysterious red seed that can have extreme effects on a person's psyche. Once it's processed into a purple gas, it can cause people to have horrific hallucinations, turning them violently against one another.
With one whiff of that gas I made from the seeds, they happily kill each other. Even their neighbors, even the ones they love.
He convinces the army to test the gas in Greenville, a small and isolated town in Washington state, to see how effective it would be when used against enemy population centers. The gas distribution machinery is set up in the town's new clock tower that rises above the Mercury Theater. Sometime after the party celebrating the tower's completion has winded down, Kaysen triggers the gas and its effects are immediate and horrific. Townspeople begin to violently and indiscriminately attack one another, resulting in mass casualties. The most brutal and effective killer is a man in a red hooded raincoat, wielding a failing axe. This raincoat killer is the town's founder and owner of the city's main industry, Mr. Woodman. His mass slaughter at the center of town is witnessed by his adult son, Harry, who is horrified, but soon succumbs to the effects of the red seed's gas himself.
One word resonated through my head. Kill! Kill! Kill!
And attacks the killer in a crazed state. Harry is ultimately knocked out during their encounter, but not before making the horrible realization
The face beneath the hood was that of my father.
despite being overwhelmed by the gas's effect, the raincoat killer still retains some understanding of what is happening to his town and who is responsible for it. It's possible that Kaysen informed Mr. Woodman that an experiment would be taking place, but kept him in the dark about the awful details of the plan. The raincoat killer fights his way through the townspeople up to the clock tower and source the gas, where he tries to kill Kaysen and stop the machine, but unfortunately fails and dies in the attempt. The US Army considers the experiment a failure, issues a gag order, and the destruction of all records. The townspeople go along with the cover-up, and any discussion of the incident from then on is unappreciated and considered taboo. Why the residents were so easily swayed is still a bit of a mystery. Perhaps the red seed gas left them unable to remember their own actions. Maybe they simply couldn't bear to face the reality of the mass murders. Or, if Harry's own explanation is to be believed,
Country folk are very patriotic.
and willing to follow government orders without question. The town's sheriff started his own investigation on the massacre in spite of the government's gag orders, and made a secret record with as much detail as he could find, but in the end was unable to expose the incident or charge anyone involved, and his files sadly only wound up gathering dust within the Sheriff Department archives. The only living person confirmed to have a clear memory of the events is Harry Woodman, who witnessed the initial release of the gas on top of the clock tower, as well as his father's mass killing at the center of town. The incident quickly fades into the town's mythology, and is remembered only as the time that a man in a red raincoat murdered dozens of people during a storm before disappearing. A social taboo also developed around the gas as well. Its chemicals so completely permeated the town's air that it managed to seep deep into the earth after the experiment. And for decades thereafter, whenever it rained, trace bits of chemicals escaped into the air and could still trigger anxiety and aggressive behaviors. As a result, everyone living in Greenville makes a habit of never going outside when it's raining, even though they don't really know why they're doing it. It's possible that at some point this was a conscious choice by the townspeople, who understood the gas's real danger, but they passed along the habit of staying in during the rain without informing the children why it was so important due to the gag order. The threat of the mythical raincoat killer kept people in line when they were young, and by the time they grew up, well, it just became how things are done in Greenville. Some years later, Harry Woodman marries a woman, and they have a son named George. Soon after George's birth, however, Harry's wife begins to exhibit signs of a serious mental illness.
My wife suffered from a mental illness, but I still loved her.
Resulting in abusive behavior and a need to obsessively control their son.
Please, Mama. I won't do it again. That hurts, Mama. I'm sorry, please. I'm sorry.
Rather than fight her for custody or even getting his wife the medical help she so obviously needed, Harry instead chooses to run, leaving the town and letting the mill and his estates be run by functionaries. George grows up without knowing his father or what happened to him, as his mother remained tight-lipped on the subject, and he quickly learned not to ask questions unless he wanted to incur her wrath.
I have no memories of my father. He left before I knew him. My mother would hit me every time I asked why. And it didn't stop there.
With Harry gone, George became the focus and victim of his mother's insanity and is horribly abused for his entire childhood, leaving him with both mental and physical scars and an obsessive need for control, which plays out in numerous ways over the rest of his life.
The strong, who can overpower others, is always correct and right. My mother stepped on my face with her stiletto heels because she had power. And when her heel pierced my cheek, I learned to respect her.
During this period of time, Kaysen travels the country, spreading rumors of the mystical powers that the red seeds contain.
Between 10 and 20 years ago, I noticed that these red seeds were special, and someone else did too. Someone linked the red seeds to the serial killer legend and said, if you eat the red seeds and then kill someone, you will become immortal. This new fabricated legend was passed on from one to the next.
He also kills numerous women to sprout more red trees, as the only way to create a sapling is to place a seed in a woman's womb, fertilizing it, and then letting the roots suck the life force completely, leaving only a withered husk of the woman behind. Once a sapling has sprouted, they can be planted normally and will thrive and grow into a tree quickly with little effort. A federal agent named Brian Xander Morgan starts working a case most likely related to the Red Seed murders and attracts Kaysen's attention and wrath. He plants a seedling in Xander's wife, Valentine, and then forces the agent to make a choice to mercy kill her before the tree sprouts.
Please, darling, shoot me. I'd rather die. If you love me, let me die.
Unfortunately, Xander is unable to bring himself to pull the trigger, and Valentine tragically dies once the tree rapidly grows from within her. Unable to live with his inaction, Xander looked towards his young son, Francis Zach Morgan, a witness to the entire scene, and cautions him to have the courage to do what he couldn't before taking his own life.
At times we must purge things from this world because they should not exist. Even if it means losing someone that you love. Yes, I couldn't do it. However, you can. When the time comes and you have to make that decision, make the right one.
Okay, Zach?
Once Xander's lifeless body hits the floor, Kaysen immediately focuses his attention on Zach, and with one swipe of his demonic hand, sends the terrified boy into a catatonic state, and leaves him with a disfiguring wound running from his hairline through his eyebrow and down across the bridge of his nose. While catatonic, Zach is locked within a dream state, where he's contacted by an entity that looks exactly like he did before Kaysen's attack, with no facial wound nor hair turned white by terror. He calls himself York.
Who are you? My name is York. Me and you will always be together, okay, Zach?
And offers to take over for Zach and live his life, since Zach isn't capable of coping with the circumstance and loss of his family. Zach agrees, and Francis York Morgan is born. It's not entirely clear what York is. It's possible he's another personality that Zach created to protect himself from trauma, but since he brings along a power, York is able to catch glimpses of the spirit world whenever he's at the site of a horrific tragedy. It's likely there's something supernatural to his origins.
About that, Zach and I saw him kill Anna in the lumber mill. He killed her. Right in there. Oh, one thing. Please don't ask me about Zach. That's a private matter.
Also pointing in this direction is the fact that York's constant conversations with Zach kept that personality from disappearing entirely, suggesting that York on some subconscious level understands that he's just there to support and assist Zach.
Why did you bring Zach back? Who the hell are you two? How did you get out of the Red Room?
Wherever he came from, York fully inhabits Zach's life, to the point where he doesn't remember he's not the real Francis Morgan, and starts to think of Zach as an aspect of his own personality that comes to the forefront whenever he's threatened and needs to use violence to defend himself.
Looks like we're being welcomed. Zach, I'll let you handle the meet and greet. Amazing. Great. Next shot.
York is so completely wrapped up in self-delusion that when he looks in mirrors, he can't see the massive scar on his face or his pure white hair, the two physical remnants of Kaysen's attack.
I get it. You're the special agent Scarface that everyone's yakking about. Nice to meet you, Francis.
Special Agent Scarface? I'd need a bigger scar to live up to that name. Call me York. That's what everyone calls me.
What? You got it. York.
These mental blocks are so severe that York doesn't even realize he's introducing himself as Zach whenever he speaks to people. At some point during this period of time, Harry Woodman returns to town under the name Harry Stewart, and he uses his intermediaries to transfer all of his old holdings to his new identity. Feeling guilty for abandoning the town, his son, and still worried about the long-term effects of the purple gas, he plans to watch over Greenvale and intervene if anything seems to be going awry. To ensure that no one recognizes him, as well as to protect himself from the remnants of the gas, Harry also wears a gas mask whenever he's outside his home. After graduating high school, George joins the sheriff department and throws himself into the job wholeheartedly, impressing everyone with his ability and severe manner. He also becomes obsessed with bodybuilding.
Exercise keeps me healthy. I haven't missed a day since I started in high school.
Now that's impressive. Remind me to get more exercise, Zach.
Seeking to perfect his body so he will never feel like a weak victim again. Despite these steps, though, he's unable to sever himself emotionally from his mother, and continues living with her in the house he grew up in. Years later, sometime after becoming sheriff of Greenvale, George also falls into a relationship with Diane Ames, the eldest daughter of one of the richest families in town. But he finds this relationship unfulfilling, as even though Diane is younger, She has too powerful a personality and won't give George the control over the relationship he craves.
If I may be so bold, who was the lucky man?
Oh, I sleep with anyone I wish. Anyone I prefer to sleep with. I could sleep with you, if you like.
I'm flattered by your offer, but I don't think that would be appropriate.
When George realizes that Thomas McLean is in love with him, he decides to also pursue a relationship with the young man as well, which helps satisfy the need for dominance that drives him. Emily Wyatt then moves to Greenville from Seattle with her parents, and unfortunately has a bit of trouble fitting into the rural small-town life. Thanks to continuing to wear her wild fashions from the city, unfounded rumors about her promiscuity begin to spread around school.
She'll screw anyone. That's what they said. Totally unfounded, of course. Anyway, after that I just sort of chose not to really trust gossip.
George, unable to resist her beauty and maybe emboldened by the rumors,
When I first saw her, I realized I was such a fool. A fool for being satisfied by the petty girls from this countryside town.
asks Emily out, even though she's only 16 at the time.
Okay, he did ask me out when I first came to town. I was still in high school.
Unsurprisingly, Emily turns George down, as he wasn't her type, and, the whole being twice her age thing. But the two eventually become friends, and Emily even joins the sheriff department after her mother's death and graduation. Even though Emily only regards George's initial romantic attempt as a blip within her own life, for George, it's the catalyst for a secret and all-consuming obsession he has for her for over a decade.
It was so much better back then. We had so much fun.
Emily? That was before you came.
Also around this time period, the city's lumber industry also began a decline, thanks to the rise of environmental protests, right around the time Emily came to town.
When I first joined the force, this lumber mill was still in full swing.
It closed up right when I first moved here.
And now it's totally abandoned.
Putting a large number of people out of work and setting the town's economy on a downward spiral.
It pains me to watch my hometown lose so many citizens.
During this period of time, York completed his university degree and became an FBI agent just like his father before him. In this line of work, he's proven incredibly adept at catching serial killers. And thanks to his gift of being able to witness the spiritual echoes left by horrible murderers, he also has an edge over other agents with tracking down the perpetrators. A few years into his relationship with George, Thomas's mother dies and he inherits her bar. With no desire to run such an establishment, he was at a loss at what to do with his life. That is until George offered him a position at the sheriff department as his assistant.
All right, don't worry. I'll get my assistant Thomas to take care of it.
Thomas transfers the deed to his younger sister Carol, who immediately drops out of high school at only 16 to run the business full-time. This seems like it would run afoul of laws about minors selling alcohol, but with Greenville being a small town and her brother being involved in a romantic relationship with the sheriff, it's not really surprising that the authorities would look the other way. At some point shortly thereafter, George has Thomas enlist Carol into their sadomasochistic relationship, which finally provides George with the control over a young girl he craved for years. Eager to please George, the McLeans transformed the storage area under the bar into a private playroom for their numerous sexual rendezvous. After discovering the red seeds during a case in Boston, York learns that similar seeds were found in several past female homicide cases.
The murders with the red seeds. Officially, the Bureau has not made a statement about these seeds. Some even claim that they are irrelevant to the killings. But after the red seeds were found in a Boston homicide, I've been unable to get them out of my head. I've even gone through all of the files looking for similar cases.
Over the years, 7 different killers had murdered dozens of young women across 8 different states. None of them knew one another or had any involvement with each other's crimes, but all left red seeds at the crime scenes. York became fascinated by the mystery, and it wasn't long before he became obsessed with finding the true origins and meanings behind the red seeds. While hunting in Greenvale, George is shocked when he's unable to kill a supernaturally powerful deer. It takes an improbably large amount of bullets to even put it down, and when he cuts it open, he discovers that its stomach is full of the red seeds. After being told about the incident, Thomas starts investigating the seeds and discovers a file hidden within the sheriff department, a 1956 record made by the sheriff about the purple gas incident. He keeps digging and soon learns the rumors of a ritual that involves consuming the red seeds and performing a series of human sacrifices on rainy nights that can make a person immortal.
He's the one who told me about the Raincoat Killer. About how to become divine, too. He didn't believe any of it, but when he told me, it all made sense.
Even though he didn't believe in the ritual himself, Thomas was still desperate to please George, and shared with him this possible path towards the ultimate strength he always desired, hopefully making himself indispensable to George in the future. As soon as George found out about the ritual, everything for him clicked into place. From why he was born in such a podunk town, beaten by his mother, and Emily's rejection, his abuse and disappointments were just in preparation for something greater.
Ultimate power!
George eventually seeks out Kaysen and receives additional details about the seed's history and power, and is ultimately convinced to go through with the ritual once Kaysen feeds his ego by bestowing him with a special locket and assuring George that he was the chosen one.
I gave him a toy locket, and he was so impressed, so moved. But he wasn't very intelligent. He was born in this town, you see, and it took him too long to discover the red seeds. Binding down people's rules is a sign of small-mindedness, and that was what George represented in life.
In return for the confidence boost, a grateful George allows Kaysen to use his mother for fertilizer for a red tree, hoping that he'll finally be able to break out from her control by making her death his first step towards immortality. To complete the ritual, George was in need of 4 victims, and he already had 2 in mind, so he gets Carol to recruit more women into a sex cult. She entices 2 of her high school friends to join the secret club beneath the Galaxy of Terror: Anna Graham, Greenvale's famed local beauty and aspiring model, and Becky Ames, Diane's younger sister and Anna's best friend.
Getting Anna and Becky involved was all too easy. Carol and Thomas built a secret club for me. All we had to do was tell them about it, and they were giddy to join us immediately.
Swayed by the exclusivity of the club, both girls also made easy targets because they lacked any close parental supervision. Anna's mother Sally frequently spent the night at her boyfriend Richard's trailer, often leaving Anna to her own devices, while Becky's parents were regularly absent as they traveled abroad frequently. George is confident he'll be able to control them, as the seeds functions both as a narcotic and a potent aphrodisiac, and are extremely addictive as well.
That's where I used the seeds on Anna and Becky. Amazing results, let me tell you. They went berserk, like cats in heat. Anna, especially, enjoyed the seeds.
Anna loves the seeds and the experience by being part of the club.
The first time he used it on me, it was so amazing.
But Becky, who's dating Quint, the son of the local bar owner, is troubled by it. She's drawn to George's powerful personality, but is frightened as well. Becky, however, tells Quint about the seeds, and he figures that if he can sell the drug made from them, he can provide Becky with the kind of life she expects as the daughter of a rich family.
But I did all this for her.
I started out delivering because I wanted the extra cash. But you know, things like this change over time. As you can see, her family is loaded, and I live in a trailer house. She's out of my league, you know? And so I wanted to be the kind of guy she could be with.
Quint, you already are. You didn't need money for that. Day 3. He doesn't let anything slip. I'm really worried about Becky.
Becky steals a large stash of the seeds, grinds them into a powder, and Quince sells them outside of town and ends up earning enough money to buy Becky an engagement ring.
Delivery man Q won't be able to protect Becky.
Don't ask me for anything more. You'll get us both killed.
Despite her misgivings, Becky continues to take part in the sex club activities because she's under George's thrall and his access to the seeds. On the final night before the game's story begins, Becky and Anna meet George at the town's abandoned lumber mill for what they think is another fun red seed-fueled sexual encounter. Once they're drugged out on the seed, George goes homicidal and attacks a bound Anna, biting off her tongue and quickly slicing open her midsection. Anna tore George's locket from around his neck during the attack, and while she bled out on the floor, a terrified Becky fled the scene.
I left her there. She was suffering so much, and I just ran away.
Meanwhile, across town, Nick, the co-owner of the A&G Diner, meets with Diane for drinks at the Galaxy of Terror, the bar owned by the McLeans, and a few hours later follows Diane back to the Muses Gallery to continue the riveting discussion on the arts until morning. Unbeknownst to Nick, he was followed by his wife Olivia, who planned to confront her husband about his suspected infidelity.
Diane was there too, but the real problem is where they go to next, right?
But ultimately, she loses her nerve once she's spotted and locks eyes with Diane in the dark outside of the Muses Gallery. A few hours after the killing, George takes Anna's nude body to a nearby forest park after the rain stops, where he wraps her in red velvet and displays her as the ritual demands on a tree. He weeps, prays, and begs for Anna's forgiveness before trying to pry his special locket from her hand, but is unable to break her death grip and is forced to leave without it. Becky, who had followed George from a distance all the way to the park, cautiously approaches Anna's body after his departure. She drops a photo of George's back, taken during the assault in the mill near the tree, and easily removes the locket from Anna's grasp before rushing home to grieve and barricade herself, unsure of what to do next. Later that morning, Anna's body is found by Jim Green and his grandsons Isaac and Isaiah Ingram, a set of cherubic twins who have an eerie connection to the spirit world. The body is reported and George arrives to investigate his own crime. He sends reports on the body along with photographs to the state authorities and then begins planning his next murder of the one that got away, Becky Ames. That night, the FBI is alerted to the murder. The way the corpse was displayed matches examples of the Red Seed murders, and York put out an alert that he should be notified if any crimes following that MO occur anywhere in America. His boss, Bob Abrams, approves York's plan to immediately travel to Greenville and contacts the Greenville Sheriff Department, ordering them to halt the investigation until York's arrival. This brings us to the main plot of the game, because that night while sleeping, York dreams of a strange room and two angels that look just like the Ingram twins. In this dream world, the angels offer the agent cryptic clues about what he'll find in Greenville. York also notices a map covered with tiny dolls of Kaysen, each one dressed in a different outfit, along with red tree symbol pins, all placed on locations where Red Seed-related murders have been committed. But because he's dreaming, York is unable to make any conscious connection between that information and the crimes he's investigating. York wakes and prepares some coffee before driving to Greenville. He has a habit of practicing a type of augury with the patterns Milk makes in his coffee, and that morning he comes away believing,
It said, "Tomorrow you'll arrive in a place that will change your fate."
York drives to Greenville overnight, and as he nears the town, he finds himself caught in a powerful rainstorm. This doesn't make him take any steps to drive more safely, however, and while driving he's distracted by talking on the phone, using his laptop, and smoking a cigarette. He's forced to swerve down a hill and total his car to avoid a hooded figure that was standing in the middle of the road. While York is relatively unharmed, his laptop and cell phone are destroyed in the car crash, and he's forced to walk through a wooded conservation area back to the highway. On his way, he finds himself attacked by figures known as Shadows, the angry spirits of the many people who've died in Greenvale's history. At first, York isn't too surprised to see them. His supernatural abilities allow him to see spirits regularly. Then he discovers that these shadows are different, that they're capable of hurting and perhaps even killing him.
I've been through a lot of crazy situations, but that one takes the cake. It's the first time I've been attacked so directly.
He's then forced to rely on Zack's combat abilities to defend himself, although that combat happens only in the spiritual realm. While it's a little confusing, at no point is York actually firing a weapon in the real world. Meanwhile, George and Emily have driven out to the bridge at the end of town to await York's arrival. At some point, George heads up the road to see what's keeping York, and ducks into the conservation area to try to kill the agent before he makes it to town. Because York is still trapped in the spiritual version of Greenvale, we don't see exactly what George does. Just the spiritual world's interpretation of it. In this case, that's the Raincoat Killer appearing and attempting to murder York with an axe. Just as George didn't actually dress in a raincoat and stand out in the middle of the highway, he doesn't put on a costume here to actually chase York around. I'll just warn you now, this can get a little confusing though, because George actually does do that later in the story. York escapes the conservation area and runs to the bridge, meeting Emily Wyatt for the first time.
She's easy on the eyes. Definitely worth a trip to the primitive world.
He's immediately attracted to her, which may have something to do with the fact that her voice reminds him of his long-dead mother.
If you don't mind me asking, did you walk all the way here?
I'm sure your father wants to congratulate you.
George arrives from out of the woods and immediately inserts himself between Emily and York, an action York correctly interprets as jealousy, making him instantly suspicious of George's character. He profiles George as the type to see himself as a feudal king, who would be paranoid about anyone coming into his fiefdom and throwing greater power around. York responds, rather immaturely, by lighting a cigarette and blowing smoke into George's face. This immediate mistrust of one another will go on to underline the rest of their interactions. Emily takes York to the Great Deer Yard Hotel to get some rest after his car accident. York sleeps for nearly an entire day, and again dreams of the angels in a red forest. This time they're joined by a young boy who also has warnings to offer.
Don't breathe. Hold your breath. They can't see you if you hold your breath.
York doesn't recognize this as the young Zack Morgan. The next morning, York meets Polly Oxford, the owner and operator of the hotel. She invites him to join her for breakfast, and when he gets his morning cup of coffee, he notices an unusual symbol in the milk. The letters FK stand out with surprising clarity. He becomes instantly convinced that these letters are going to be central to the mystery that he's there to solve.
Did you see that, Zack? Clear as a crisp spring morning. F.K. in the coffee. I knew I could count on it. Never fails.
Heading over to the sheriff's department, York meets Thomas, who he helps search for the key to the file room where the file on Anna's murder is being kept. In one of the game's many elements of foreshadowing, York finds the key to the file room down in the basement cells, in a room where a mattress has been hastily propped over to cover a secret door. While doing something seemingly innocuous, York is actually just a few feet away from discovering the secret to the entire mystery. After York finishes reading the file, George announces that Anna's autopsy is complete and suggests that York and Emily drive with him to the hospital immediately. Thomas demurs from joining them. He has already become violently ill when seeing Anna's body at the crime scene, and wasn't even able to help bring her to the morgue. This is most likely due to his guilt over his part in Anna's murder, but York accepts the explanation that Thomas has a weak constitution. On the drive to the hospital, Emily and York get to know one another better, but George remains cold and distant.
Agent Morgan, get us there quickly, but drive within the speed limit. Just because you have a badge doesn't mean you can drive like a maniac.
George, what are you, his mother?
We just need to get the autopsy results.
Agent York isn't accustomed to the town yet. Give him a little slack.
At the hospital, York meets Fiona, the hospital's receptionist, and Usha, the town doctor. They go to see Anna's body, and after listening to Usha offer some theories about the killer, York shuts him down.
Usha, please, limit your report to your findings as a doctor. Criminal profiling is my job. You're wrong, also.
Profiling is his job, after all, and gets permission to examine the corpse for himself. He's able to come to a few conclusions about the murder. That she was killed indoors, then moved to the park after the rain had stopped. This convinces him that they'll be able to find significant evidence if they can track down the murder site. He also finds brand new evidence as well, a red seed lodged in Anna's throat, which York uses to justify taking over the entire investigation, given its concrete link to multiple murders in other states. Needless to say, George is displeased to find that he's going to have the FBI looking over his shoulder as he attempts to complete the ritual.
What in the hell do you mean, Agent Morgan? I know I said I was passionate, but you can't think I did this.
York leaves the morgue to take a cigarette break, and finds himself pulled into another spiritual other world. There he sees glimpses of Anna, forever fleeing as he tries to chase her down, his path obstructed by more malevolent shadows. When York finally makes it out of the other world, he encounters Harry Stewart and his assistant Michael Tillotson for the first time. Michael passes along Harry's message that York should be careful, because the rain drives people crazy in Greenvale. George, meanwhile, quickly dismisses the warning as being nothing more than a local superstition.
That's how he always is. Always spouting that nonsense. Don't give it any thought. It's all gibberish.
Later at the crime scene, York interviews the twins about finding the body, but is surprised to discover that they're more interested in talking about how Anna's been since her murder.
Now then, Isaiah, tell me, what did you find here?
Anna, she was so pretty. She had a red dress on. Her hair was shining. Bright gold hair. There were lots of animals around her. Squirrels, weasels, and a snake. A real snake. We didn't know until then. But we know now. Anna was the fairy of the forest. She was a goddess. She smiled when she saw us. She looked so happy.
They claim to have seen her walking around the woods in a red dress, playing with animals, in her new role as a goddess of the forest. York finds this a little peculiar because in his hospital visions of Anna, she'd also been running around in a red dress. It appears that while everyone else saw the dead body tied to the tree, the twins were only ever able to see the other world version of Anna. York searches the area for clues and comes across a few strange items. A picture of a person's back with a red inverted peace sign tattoo, a wood chip with flakes of rust in it, and a broken stiletto heel. Apparently the Greenvale Sheriff's Department missed a lot of key clues. According to George and Emily, Diane, the owner of the local art gallery, is the only person who would be so concerned about fashion that she would wear high heels even into the woods. Plus, she left town the day after the murder for an art auction. Due to Diane's fashion choices and movements, York decides then and there to talk to her the moment she returns. The wood chip proves to be the more important clue, however. Rusting metal and rotting wood immediately bring the old lumber mill to George and Emily's minds, and York decides that it would be the perfect place to commit a murder, since one would be guaranteed privacy. The three hurry over to the lumber mill, but once they arrive, York insists on entering it alone.
Now, hold on a minute. We're investigating this case together.
Listen, I can't risk the crime scene being compromised by you two.
What are you saying? You're not the only professional law enforcement officer here, Agent Morgan.
As he doesn't completely trust either of them yet, and he has to be completely sure that no one compromises the crime scene. Inside the lumber mill, York finds himself once again pulled into the spiritual other world, where he has to fend off attacks from shadows and flee from the raincoat killer while looking for clues. Eventually he finds a room that has been transformed into a sacrificial chamber, complete with altar and red velvet wall hangings. Confident that he's found the murder site and certain that the person with the inverted peace sign tattoo on their back is the killer, York heads back outside and tells George and Emily what he's discovered, but not before forcing them to show him their backs to clear them of being the person in the photo.
Anyway, by showing me your backs, we can clear up most of my concerns about you. Isn't that for the best? You do want to remove yourselves from the suspect list. It will make things a lot easier.
This is insane. Your methods are rude, insulting, and out of the question. And Emily is a female officer. Forcing her to show you her back is harassment. I don't care if you are FBI or not. You are out of line.
George, it's okay. Let's just show him and get it over with.
Emily, are you crazy?
Look, we flash our backs and he'll start trusting us a little more. Right? Agent York?
Emily's back is clean, but George's back is a maze of scars, the evidence of a lifetime of brutal abuse. York immediately begins to empathize with George and dismisses him as a suspect, which proves to be a mistake, of course, but York's natural tendency to empathize with abused children, and the fact that George doesn't have the tattoo seen within the photo, causes him to overlook his training in profiling, which would have told him that George's monstrous childhood abuse is the exact kind of crucible in which serial killers are forged. Thomas arrives at the mill and announces that they've scheduled a town meeting for the next day, so that York can introduce himself to everyone and assure the townspeople that the investigation is all under control. As the mill is put on lockdown until other deputies can document and collect all of the evidence, the day's investigation ends. The next day, while everyone is preparing for the town hall meeting, Lily Ingram, Jim's daughter and the twins' mother, takes Isaac and Isaiah to visit Becky. They're worried about how she's coping, since after Anna's murder she's become a shut-in and refuses to leave her family home.
But she took in the boys and told me to wait outside. Something about a special secret between just the three of them. I just couldn't understand it.
Becky gets a moment alone with the twins and gives them George's locket, a letter, and the broken high heel to deliver to Diane when they see her next.
We took it to the art gallery and gave it to Diane.
Is that all Becky gave you?
Just when we were leaving to take the box to Diane, Becky called us back. She handed us something. It was small and round. She told us to keep it safe in our pocket and give it to Diane.
At the town meeting, York gives a speech about how to keep safe with a killer on the loose, but he mostly sees the event as a way to meet all of the other townspeople, his potential suspects, in one convenient gathering. While some of the people are noticeably strange, Wesley, for example, may be a helpful spirit, and Brian is definitely a ghost. Only one of them seems particularly suspicious, Nick, who co-owns the A&G diner with his wife Olivia. He's oddly cagey when talking to York, which immediately draws his attention.
I'd like to ask you a few questions about Anna Graham. Did you notice anything strange about her prior to the incident? Nick, are you hiding something?
No, nothing.
You sure?
I'm sorry, but I don't like repeating myself.
After the meeting, York, George, Emily, and Thomas go out to dinner and chat about police work. York, who's generally terrible with people, disturbs everyone with stories of the rapists and serial killers he's captured over the years. Conversation turns to the case and how Emily doesn't believe that she's up to investigating such an extreme act. To comfort her, York explains his theory of morality. The size of any crime is irrelevant because every crime turns someone into a victim, which is always morally unacceptable, no matter the scale.
A crime is a crime. Size doesn't matter. There is no big and small. Crimes always have a criminal and a victim. No victim will ever welcome a crime, no matter what its size. So, fundamentally, there is no difference in size.
Of course, but still, I don't view shoplifting and Anna's murder as the same level of crime.
When the conversation returns to Anna's death, Thomas begins to sob. It's unclear whether he's genuinely feeling guilty or simply attempting to change the subject to keep York from noticing anything strange about his or George's reactions. Whatever the reason, his crying works and the dinner is cut short. York heads back to the hotel to file a report on the day's events. Later that night, Kaysen drives into town and, after dropping Diane off at her gallery, checks into the Great Deer Yard Hotel. Sleeping in the back of his truck is his dog, Willie, who looks like an adorable Dalmatian, but is in reality a powerful demonic force whose job it is to keep an eye on Kaysen for the evil forces that control them both, the Red Tree. The next morning, York meets Kaysen, who introduces him to the unusual saplings he sells while traveling across the country. Kaysen also informs York about some of their strange features, specifically that only he can get them to sprout.
I'm pretty much the only one who can make those saplings sprout. There's a trick to it that can't really be passed on, you know? It's like, the secret of making a good smoked ham, something like that.
But once they've done that, they'll thrive no matter what. York immediately dismisses Kaysen as a suspect because he wasn't in town when the murders were committed, but he does find the man instantly suspicious and asks Polly what she knows about the unusual plants. Polly is, sadly, unhelpful.
No, mustard has nothing to do with it. I was wondering if you know of anyone that Kaysen didn't give a sapling to.
Oh, too much pepper. I did think it might be. I'm sorry.
Ah, Zach, I forgot. We'll never get anything out of her, will we?
York, George, and Emily head to the Muses Gallery so that York can interview Diane. But as they arrive, York once again insists on going in alone for a private interview, to George and Emily's annoyance. Inside the lobby, York runs into Olivia, who went to the museum to confront Diane about the suspected infidelity with her husband Nick, but ultimately lost her nerve. She gives York an unconvincing lie for her visit before making a hasty retreat.
Zach, she was lying about something. She said trees, not paintings of trees. She doesn't need to come here to see trees. There's tons of trees outside.
Upon approaching the gallery's back office, York overhears Diane and Carol arguing about who should have George's locket, but they don't speak in enough detail that York is able to determine what they're talking about at the time. After Carol leaves with the locket, York grows suspicious of Diane when she lies about the content of her argument with the irate singer.
One other thing. That argument with Carol just now.
She's always like that. She thinks of me as an enemy, always bickering at what I say.
Is there any reason for that?
Perhaps because someone she liked ended up with me in my bed?
Well, that would explain it, yes.
Playing into her perceived role as the town's sexual libertine, and claiming that Carol was just upset that she'd had sex with someone she was fond of. Diane claims that she was drinking with Nick at Carol's bar, the Galaxy of Terror, during the time of the murder, and York warns her not to leave town while the investigation is ongoing. Leaving the gallery, York is convinced that Diane has some connection to the crime, but isn't sure just what that might be. His curiosity is piqued when he sees that Kaysen has been inside the gallery the entire time, waiting in a back room to talk to Diane. York asks Emily what she knows about Kaysen, but she has little information to offer. He claims to be a salesman, but never seems to actually be selling anything. She mentions that he seems very close to the Ingham family, especially the twins, and York makes a note of the information. Emily and York arrive at the diner to talk to Nick, but before they get a chance to, they have a run-in with Harry, who orders his standard sandwich: turkey, strawberry jam, and cereal on white bread. At Harry's behest, York samples the sandwich and finds it surprisingly delicious.
I can't believe it. This is fantastic. It's really good. Olivia, I'm sorry, but can I change my order? I'll have what Harry is having.
They question Nick about his whereabouts on the night of Anna's murder, and he backs up Diane's alibi. But York has a gut feeling that Nick and Diane are hiding something more sinister, though he can't put in his finger on exactly what that is. They turn to Olivia for answers, but she won't talk to them until Nick is out of earshot, and asks them to return that night after the diner is closed. That evening, George breaks into Becky's home and brutally attacks her while she's sleeping. He pins Becky to the bed and feeds her the seeds, then slices open her midsection with a hunting knife, and strings her up inside the bathroom with wires rigged to tear open her throat and stomach when they're cut. Once the tableau has been created, George heads home to wait for the assault to be reported, likely telling Thomas to check on Becky and ensure the call goes out promptly. But before that can happen, Quint finds Becky and calls the police. Meanwhile, back at the diner, Olivia tells York and Emily about what happened between Nick and Diane on the night of the murder, and it's clear that the poor woman's stressed and frustrated that she was unable to confront Nick or Diane with her suspicions of his infidelity. During their conversation, Emily gets a radio call from George about an incident over at Becky's place, and also informs her that it may be connected to the previous murder.
He was called in by Quint, but he wasn't making any sense. We have no further details. I've sent Thomas over there. Can you go back him up?
Yes, sir.
One other thing. It sounded like he said, Raincoat Killer. This may well be related to the murder case. Take all due precautions.
Upon hearing this, Olivia breaks down into sobs, suspecting the worst, that Nick may be behind this attack. And York leaves Emily to take care of Olivia and rushes over to Becky's to provide Thomas with backup. York arrives to find Thomas outside the home with a hysterical Quint, who's unable to answer any questions and just keeps repeating Becky's name over and over again. York heads inside and is pulled into the other world and is once again confronted with shadows and the spirit of the Raincoat Killer. When York returns to the real world, he's standing within Becky's blood-spattered bedroom. The running shower brings him to the attached room where he discovers Becky hanging in the shower, barely clinging to life. York gently asks Becky to identify her attacker, and just as she attempts to speak without her tongue, George, Emily, and Thomas burst into the room. Upon seeing that Becky is still alive and under the guise of helping the dying girl, George frantically orders Thomas to cut her down, knowing full well his trap will finish her off. Becky begins to freak out and wildly gestures with both her eyes and head that cutting the wires is a terrible idea. Thomas is roughly pushed aside by George when he fumbles using the wire cutters, and against York's protest, George cuts the wire in fear that Becky will finger him at any moment. All of Becky's weight falls on the razor wire wrapped around her throat, slicing it open. As she dies, Becky attempts to point to George, but when York turns to look, he's suddenly transported into the woods, where he sees Anna in her red dress, reaching out for Becky's hand. But the vision ends as Becky violently coughs up blood, seeds, and a small key, before finally expiring. Searching Becky's bedroom, York discovers a wall safe with wood pattern matching the keychain on the key spit out by the teen. Using the key, he opens the safe and finds Becky's sketchbook, but unfortunately all of the pages that contained writing have been torn out. York is able to read the final entry, however, by creating a pencil rubbing on the next blank page. It's a letter Becky penned to Diane, detailing the night of Anna's murder, but it doesn't name her killer.
I left her there. She was suffering so much, and I just ran away. I know he wanted to kill me too, but I'm not going to let him get away with this. Anna was holding on to that precious locket of his. He couldn't remove it from her hand, even though she was dead, but she let go of it for me, though. It was like she gave it to me. So I brought it home. I might be able to bring Anna's killer down with it. I want you to see it. I know even he wouldn't dare to harm you. He'll catch me, though, if I go into town. I'm trapped in my house. So I've asked Isaac and Isaiah to deliver it.
They get an important clue, however. Becky took the killer's locket and sent it to Diane via the twins. The next morning, York and Emily go and talk to the twins, who confirm that the locket ended up with Diane, and York now realizes that during the conversation he overheard at the gallery, Carol took the mysterious locket owned by the killer.
I saw you with Diane in the art gallery that day.
Well, yeah, I was there in the room, but I was only chatting with Diane. Oh, then Carol burst in, all angry looking. While Carol and Diane had their talk, I just sat there like a frog. Yeah, so Carol took the locket from Diane, but that has nothing to do with me, right?
Back at the sheriff department, York announces that Diane seems to be the key to the whole case. Wanting to get more intel on her relationship with Nick, he decides to set up a tail on the pair that night when they meet for their drinks at the Galaxy of Terror. He orders Emily to follow Nick from when he leaves the diner, George to follow Diane when she leaves the gallery, and Thomas to keep an eye on both of them within the Galaxy of Terror. Later that night, Nick waits for Diane at the bar, but she's strangely a no-show, and after waiting an hour, he leaves and drives over to the gallery to see what's keeping her, with York and company following close behind. Unfortunately, early onto their tail, an 18-wheeler drifts into the oncoming traffic lane. York is able to dodge the near collision, but it results in the patrol car spinning out, and the team lose their sight of Nick. Meanwhile, George, waiting for their arrival in the Muse Gallery parking lot, hears raised voices coming from Diane's office. He had watched Nick enter the gallery a few minutes earlier, and from the sound of things, the man probably wasn't pleased that Kaysen's late-night visit prevented Diane from meeting him at the bar. George begins to ponder the whereabouts of the others, because they were supposedly following right behind Nick, but he'd already been inside 10 minutes. That's when he receives another radio communication informing him of the team's near-fatal crash, and it's at that moment he decides to use this golden opportunity to sacrifice Diane for the ritual and frame poor Nick for the crime. Inside the gallery, Nick and Diane make up. Kaysen is told to hit the road, and the two make plans to head back to the Galaxy of Terror. Nick waits for Diane in the lobby to let her say her goodbyes to Kaysen in private, and while he's waiting, he's knocked out from behind by George. Hearing the heavy footsteps coming from her office, Diane turns, expecting to see an impatient Nick, but is shocked when it's George who strides through her bedroom door. Ignoring her question, George pushes Diane into the adjoining bathroom and slams the door shut, leaving Kaysen to listen outside. Seeing the large knife in George's hand, Diane realizes that he's the mysterious man her little sister feared, and the killer she spoke of in the last letter. Knowing he's on borrowed time, George quickly pins Diane to the ground and forces the red seeds down her throat despite her protests. He gives her one last passionate kiss before biting off her tongue and ramming his knife deep into her midsection. As Diane bleeds on the floor, she watches George use her blood to paint a red tree symbol on one of her precious tree paintings, before losing consciousness. George drags Diane's body to the lobby and uses thin ropes and wire to suspend Diane over the giant metal tree sculpture to pose her like the red tree symbol, her blood gradually dyeing the metal red. Given the time constraints and the fact that Kaysen was there during the attack, it's safe to assume George had some assistance from the salesman with this massive feat of engineering. The two then hide Nick's car in the woods nearby, and since he doesn't have time to get away in his own car, Kaysen heads to the basement trapdoor in Diane's bedroom and has George lock him inside so it will appear impossible for him to have been involved in Diane's murder. George then heads outside to wait for the rest of his team, and when they arrive, he announces that Nick never got to the gallery. York notices that he's acting strange, and when confronted, George lies and says that he's had a few swigs of alcohol due to the stress of working on his first murder case.
I'm on edge, and I needed one. It was only a little, though. I'm still in control.
The front doors are locked, but luckily York finds a secret back entrance through a small building behind the gallery. He enters alone and uses his powers to investigate the scene. He finds clues of what happened and fights his way past shadows until finally working his way back to the lobby. There he finds an unconscious Nick and Diane, and unlocks the main door to let the rest of them in to help examine the crime scene. Emily notices that Diane is still alive, and they quickly move to rescue her before the wires give out and drop her onto the tree statue's spikes. George tries to use brute strength to knock down the statue, but York worries that he's taking too much time. He rushes up to the mezzanine and leaps off, tackling Diane just as her bonds break, moving both of them past the statue so that they can free fall into George, who breaks their impact. Thomas is sent out to call for an ambulance, but Diane stands up and, in her drugged-out state, begins to offer an analysis of the erotic and horrific power of the statue she's standing next to. Everyone is frozen in shock by Diane's monologue, except for Nick, who begins to slowly walk towards her. George, seeing an opportunity to finish off Diane before she's coherent enough to finger him as their attacker, makes a move to grab Nick and arrest him for attempted murder. When Nick violently pushes George away, he throws an elbow back into the teetering statue and force snaps the few remaining supports, and the statue begins to topple over. Emily attempts to move Diane out of the way, but she refuses to move and the statue falls towards them both. Diane is crushed to death, and Emily is saved from death herself only thanks to being pushed out of the statue's path at the last moment by York. After her near-death experience, Emily freaks out and York attempts to comfort her. Then he sees Willie wander into the lobby. The dog attracts York's attention and leads him through the gallery to the secret back room and the locked storage basement underneath it. York breaks the lock on the door and opens it, discovering Kaysen inside. Kaysen quickly comes up with a lie to explain his presence. He'd come to the gallery for a rendezvous with Diane when Nick showed up, and a suddenly wary Diane locked him out of sight. It's a brilliantly conceived lie, because at this point there are 3 people who were in the gallery when Diane was killed, and both Kaysen and George need Nick to be the prime suspect, so Kaysen crafts a story that suggests Nick had a violent temper, and Diane was afraid of him. The next day, after Nick is safely locked away in a cell for the night after numerous interviews, George invites York out for a drink.
York, do you have a moment?
What is it, George?
There's something I'd like to talk to you about. Do you have any time later?
Can't we just do it here?
If possible, I'd like to go to a bar. Of course, we don't really have to.
A bar? Now that sounds like a good idea.
There, George makes a bold play to make sure he's above suspicion. He takes York completely into his confidence, revealing the horrifying story of child abuse that resulted in the scars all over his back and face. Then he apologizes for all of the times he interfered with York's investigative style, and pledges to work closely with him from then on.
York, I'm sorry. I'll follow your orders from now on. You'll have my total cooperation.
George, you've been as cooperative as you can be. You even invited an FBI guy to a bar for drinks.
It's a brilliant move, and his heart-to-heart manages to allay York's suspicion for the time being. York then directly confronts Carol about the locket she took from Diane, but she still refuses to give him a straight answer about it. Shortly thereafter, Emily arrives at the bar. Unbeknownst to George, York extended the invitation to Emily, who was eager to let loose after the horrors of the night before, and even took the time to change into an evening gown. Startled by Emily's sudden appearance, George quickly excuses himself and claims that he's going to be heading home for the night, allowing York and Emily to spend some time getting to know each other better. York learns about the death of Emily's mother, and the special gold leaf necklace her mother left her that she keeps with her at all times. And the creepy fact that George tried to date her when she was underage. They split up and York heads back to his hotel to write up a report on Diane's death. Even though George was confident that he was above York's suspicion thanks to their heart-to-heart in the Galaxy of Terror, it was clear from the interviews with Nick earlier that day that York just wasn't buying him as the serial killer. It was a pity, but he was going to have to return to his original plans of framing Thomas McClane. Additionally, despite his best efforts to convince York that Harry is just a kook, the agent has shown himself to be all too keen to listen to what the old man has to say about the Raincoat Killer. Worried what could happen if York finds the original 1956 investigation files, and the revelation within that the Raincoat Killer was more than a legend, as well as the ritual instructions that Thomas wrote for him, George decides to get rid of the evidence and frame Thomas at the same time. He heads to the sheriff's department and tells Thomas to go back home and wait for him there. Once he's gone, George enters the filing room and breaks into the filing cabinet containing the investigation materials for the 1956 massacre and all of the notes on the Raincoat Killer ritual. Then George goes to Thomas's apartment. At George's request, Thomas puts on the wig, dress, and heels. They relax and discuss the investigation. George shows him the files that he brought and orders Thomas to get rid of them, and then to go to the bar and lie low for a bit. Thomas can never refuse a direct order from George and leaves immediately without changing, while George remains in the apartment a moment longer to plant the wig he's been wearing while committing the murders, an exact match of the wig Thomas wears when he dresses as a woman. Over at the Great Deer Yard Hotel, York has just finished writing up his report, and as he's getting ready to go to sleep, Emily shows up at his door, unable to sleep and not wanting to continue to drink alone. Over the next few hours of drinking and talking, York ends up feeling comfortable enough with Emily to open up about the circumstances of the loss of his parents, and even his imaginary friend Zach. Once Emily goes home for the night, York heads to bed, chatting with Zach about their deepening feelings for her.
I think she's starting to have certain feelings for you. If that's the case, Zach, you and I are rivals. This is a very serious situation indeed. Well, if it comes to that, let it be a fair fight. Agreed?
Thomas makes the long drive up to Velvet Falls and throws the file into the river before returning to the Galaxy of Terror. Inside, he finds a distraught Carol, and they comfort one another in the secret clubhouse. Both feel that George's actions have gotten way out of hand, but neither feels strong enough to confront him. It's possible at this point Thomas may even realize, given George's recent request, that his lover is planning on framing him for the murders, while Carol, guilty over the loss of her friends, has also begun to suspect that she may be George's final target. That night, York finds himself in the White Room again, where he finds the spirit of Harry waiting for him. But York doesn't immediately recognize him because he's not wearing his famous mask. He then flashes back to the death of his parents, only now, instead of seeing his mother as merely his father's victim, she's transformed into a monster. He's shocked awake and frightened by the experience. At breakfast, York lets his coffee decide where to take the investigation next, and when he sees that a ring it leaves on a newspaper spells out the word Harry, he decides that it's finally time to confront Harry and find out what he knows about the murders and the town's history.
Looks like the time that he was talking about has come. Let's go pay the problematic rich boy who owns half of the town a visit.
He runs into Emily outside the hotel and finds out that Thomas has disappeared. Seeing no possible connection between Thomas and the murders, York isn't that concerned, and simply assumes that he's at home, drowning his sorrows. Emily assures him that the situation is more serious than that, but York tells her that irrespective of her worries, he's going to go and check in with Harry, while George and Emily look for Thomas.
Ugh, I was an idiot for thinking he might be a good pick. I really need to work on my taste in men.
Harry welcomes York into his mansion and, through Michael, agrees to help York if the agent can find the spot in the town where all of the red seeds are coming from. He offers a clue that leads York to Albero Graveyard, and inside of it, he finds a fenced-off copse of red trees, each one surrounded by a carpet of the red seeds. When he reports this back to Harry, the old man finally trusts York enough to speak to him without using Michael as an interpreter. He tells York about an incident 50 years earlier, and encourages him to find the old sheriff's files on the original Raincoat Killer. York heads to the sheriff department to look for the file, and once again finds himself pulled into the other world. After fighting his way past the shadows, he finds evidence of the theft. Suspicion falls on the missing Thomas.
Huh? Removed?
The cabinet looks like it had been forced open.
That's impossible. No one could break into there.
No. Emily, there is one person that can access that room at any time.
You don't mean Thomas?
It's too early to speculate. And profiling is my job, remember?
Emily can't believe that Thomas would try to sabotage the investigation, but George points out that he was the only one with easy access to the file room. Looking for inspiration, York asks Emily to bring him some coffee and milk. When she comes back with the coffee, he doesn't even have to read the milk. He takes the cup itself for a sign of where the files have been hidden. The cup has a logo of Velvet Falls, a local fishing spot, on it, and York immediately becomes convinced that the files will be found there. Emily reacts with disbelief, though George is strangely on board with York's bizarre suggestion.
No, Emily. Going to a waterfall just might be a good idea. In feng shui, a waterfall is known to be a source of power. Even if we find nothing there, I'm sure it will give us some power.
Thanks for the vote of confidence, George. And don't forget to bring a fishing rod.
All right. I'll go get it.
Fishing? Are you two serious?
George, do you have a net?
The trio head to the falls, and after a few minutes of fishing, York comes up with the watertight briefcase Thomas had thrown into the water the night before. Inside is all of the evidence concerning the original Raincoat Killer massacre, along with a description of an immortality ritual written in Thomas's handwriting. While York heads back to Harry's mansion with the file, Emily and George continue their search for Thomas. Emily is now certain that Thomas is involved in the murders, but fails to realize the fact that Thomas literally cannot be the killer, since he was in a car with York and Emily the night of Diane's murder. When York arrives at Harry's mansion, he finds himself once again pulled into the other world, where he sees an ominous vision. Emily, wearing a red vision of her evening gown. Before York can move towards her, a vision of his father appears and reminds York that sometimes people must sacrifice the things they love most if they want to stop evil before placing his gun up to Emily's temple. Is this a premonition of Emily's fate, or simply York getting her all mixed up with his mother again? York finds Harry waiting in a secret underground hybrid library and command center. Harry reveals that he's been keeping tabs on the investigation by hacking into the FBI's computers, and then tells York the story of the original Raincoat Killer back in 1956. Emily then arrives at the mansion to collect York. According to George, there's been a report that Thomas has been seen at his apartment. It's doubtful that this is a real call, and more likely George simply wants an excuse to break into the apartment so York can see more evidence linking Thomas to the crime. Inside the apartment, York finds evidence that two people were there in the recent past. Emily and George headed to the bridge to set up a roadblock in the hopes of catching Thomas leaving town. York points out that Thomas has had more than a day to flee if he'd wanted to, so it's much more likely that he has unfinished business here in town. Once George and Emily have left, York suddenly finds himself pulled into the other world, even though he's still out in the open. He sees a vision of Anna, which leads him to Carol's bar. York investigates it and discovers the secret sex dungeon beneath the club. Searching the room, he at long last finds George's locket, but before he can report his discovery to anyone, Thomas clubs him into unconsciousness while Carol sings upstairs. Then the two siblings transport York to the clock tower, where they tie him up while Thomas tries to decide what their next move should be. While knocked out, York finds himself trapped in a dream state. This time he's stuck in the woods as the child version of himself, literally following in his father's footsteps. He chases his father, but eventually Xander disappears, and York is alone until the red dress version of Emily and Willie arrive to comfort him. Suddenly he's an adult again, back in the red room, where the three victims stand behind the angels, giggling as they pass the Kaysen figurine back and forth. The trees that fill the red room begin to warp and crack, and suddenly blood starts spilling out of their bark. Finally York wakes up, blindfolded and tied to a chair in the clock tower. Most likely because he wants York to be part of his endgame, Kaysen calls Emily and George to tell them that York went into Carol's bar. They find the dungeon in the basement, and Willie signals that he can follow the scent of York's cigarettes.
Let him help you out, why don't you? Oh, he'd make a fine police dog.
I told you, we don't need...
Sounds good, Kaysen. We need all the help we can get. Come on, George, let's let them help us.
But they are civilians.
Do you have a better plan? As we speak, York might be...
All right. Let's have them help.
Thank you, George.
While Willie leads Emily and Kaysen to the clock tower, George brings Carol back to the sheriff department under some pretense, but in reality he's preparing her for the final stage of the ritual. Carol, who had her suspicions, begins to fight and plead with George as he drags her downstairs into the secret ritual room behind cell 5. George is too strong, though, and he force-feeds her the seeds, bites out her tongue, and then brutally stabs her, leaving her bleed to death on the floor. In the clock tower, York tries to talk Thomas into surrendering, but it doesn't go well. Thomas genuinely doesn't want to hurt York, but he can't stand up to George, so his solution is to keep York locked away until the ritual is complete, and it's too late to stop George's ascension. When left alone, York takes some time to talk with Zack about Emily, asking himself if he's really ready to be in love with someone, and face the risk of losing her the way he lost his parents. Emily and Kaysen arrive at the clock tower, but can't reach George on the radio to get any backup. Emily decides to go in on her own, and tells Kaysen to keep trying to call George. Inside the clock tower, the remnants of the gas are so thick, and Kaysen's presence nearby is so powerful, that Emily finds herself pulled into the other world temporarily. This proves extremely jarring for her, as she doesn't have York's experience with the supernatural. She blasts through some shadows and makes her way to the machine room of the clock tower. Just before she arrives, Thomas takes a moment to say goodbye to York, announcing that he believes fate can't be avoided, and that he was always going to wind up in a final confrontation with the woman who George loved more than him. He goes out into the gear room and confronts Emily, blaming her for everything that's gone wrong with George. They have an intense gun battle that ends with a wounded Thomas seeming like he's ready to surrender. But then he tries to slash Emily to death, only to have Willie save the day, mauling him until he accidentally stabs himself. Knowing that he's just moments away from dying, Thomas commits suicide, diving off of the gear face first into a swinging hook. Willie chews through York's bonds, and he comes back to talk to Emily and Kaysen. While it's sad that Thomas is dead, York announces that he wasn't the killer, pointing out that he had an alibi for each murder.
Emily, are you out of your mind? Thomas was certainly neck-deep in this. But he didn't kill the girls. He has concrete alibis for all 3 murders. He also doesn't have the reverse peace symbol on his back. These are basic facts that for sure you haven't forgotten.
This isn't accurate, of course. He only had a solid alibi for Becky and Diane's murders, but the point is still valid. The only possible killer is George.
Love G himself.
George? George is the killer? And since when did you start thinking this?
Just as they've come to that conclusion, Emily's radio springs to life. It's George, asking what happened to her search for York.
Thomas is dead. I was forced to shoot him.
I see. And you two are both all right?
York is a little weak, but we're heading back to the department now.
Okay. I'll do the same.
She tells George that Thomas is dead and York is fine, but offers no information. Everyone agrees to meet up at the sheriff's station. York and Emily arrive at the sheriff's station and start to search for George. They go through different entrances, so York is alone again, and able to be pulled into the other world, where he fights shadows and follows visions of Anna that lead him to the secret door in cell 5 below the station. Down in the secret ritual chamber, York meets up with Emily and they find the nearly dead Carol. They try to help her, but Carol isn't interested after hearing of Thomas's death. She has just enough hatred left in her to attack Emily. Just like Thomas, she was filled with jealousy over George's obsession with her. She stuffs some seeds into Emily's mouth, causing her to overdose. As Carol bleeds to death, York carries Emily out of the sheriff's station and brings her to Kaysen's truck, ordering him to take Emily to the hospital immediately. Kaysen advises York to come along as well, and York says that he has to stay and deal with George once and for all. Kaysen warns that if anything happens because York didn't come along, he's not responsible for it, which York doesn't interpret as a particularly sinister comment because he's not able to remember all of the clues in the dream world has given him about Kaysen's true nature. So while York heads into the sheriff department for a final showdown with George, Kaysen takes Emily back to the theater. Under the prolonged effects of the Red Seas, Emily hallucinates she's with York, and the seed's amorous effects allow Kaysen to easily have his way with her.
That's where I used the seeds on Anna and Becky. Amazing results, let me tell you. They went berserk, like cats in heat.
As a result, the seeds inside Emily germinate into a sapling.
Oh, didn't I tell you? Getting these saplings to sprout requires a certain technique.
Kaysen did say he was the only one who could get them to sprout. Soon enough, that tree will grow and drain out her life force. York heads back into the sheriff department, fighting his way past hordes of shadows until he finally meets George on the roof. They talk for a few moments about George's motivation and their shared appreciation for Emily. Then George completes his transformation into an ogre, and they battle in the other world. York defeats George, and he's struck by lightning, killing him and dispelling the supernatural layer over their battle, leaving George a regular human being once again, albeit one charred black and frozen in the same kind of tree pose he'd picked for his victims. York collapses after the ordeal and finds himself once again trapped in the Red Forest, this time seeing all of the people killed over the course of the story. He then finds Emily and Harry in the White Room. Emily is silent, morose, as she holds the Kaysen doll in her hands. Harry tells York that he isn't ready to die just yet, and he wakes up in the hospital. He finds out that Kaysen brought him there and left a letter for him to read. It's been more than a day since the fight with George, and York discovers, much to his surprise, that Emily was never brought to the hospital.
Emily? What, she hurt too? She hasn't come into the hospital.
What? I told Kaysen to bring her here.
Kaysen? Well, Kaysen came. He's the one who brought you here. Which reminds me. He asked me to give you this.
Inside the envelope is a key and a map directing York to George's house. He rushes over there and discovers not only that the sheriff has been living in squalor, but also evidence of the wire used in all of the crimes, and just how intense his obsession with Emily really was, with a full-on stalker shrine with numerous secret photos taken of her, and stolen items and things she used and touched in evidence bags hung around the room. York also finally meets George's sick mother. George had kept her mummified corpse hidden in the basement. While the sapling within her womb was long gone, fragments of the tree still poked out through her eye sockets.
Meeting the mother is always a bad experience after killing the son.
Seeing those little bits of the tree in this context makes York realize that the killer's symbol was never a reversed peace sign at all. It was a red tree all along. And that Kaysen had been the mastermind behind all of the Red Scene murders. Beside Mrs. Woodsman's corpse is a framed photo of a gleeful George showing off his special locket next to a bemused Kaysen. Scrawled on it in red is a message inviting York to the theater so they can have a final encounter. York rushes to the theater in the pouring rain and discovers that all of the townspeople are waiting for him. They've been driven mad by the latent gas and Kaysen's influence, and they attack him with whatever weapons they've scrounged up. York dodges past them and rushes into the theater, where he finds Kaysen looming over Emily, who sits, unconscious, in the middle of the stage. Kaysen monologues theatrically for a while, explaining his evil scheme, then reveals Emily is now the host of a red tree. York flashes back to the death of his parents and realizes Kaysen was there.
Remove that sapling from her body, Kaysen.
Xander, it's too late.
Once it's like this, I can't do anything to stop it.
And that he's now replaying the last moment of their lives. This realization allows Zack to break through his mental blocks, and suddenly he's able to remember that York is the spirit that came to him in order to protect him after Kaysen's attack. From this moment on, the real Zack is revealed, complete with pure white hair, a damaged eye, and large facial scar. He tries to shoot Emily, just as his father warned him he would have to, but he can't bring himself to do it. Emily proves stronger, however, and manages to tear the tree out of her own body, killing herself in the process.
Emily, what have you done?
Zack, I wasn't used as soil at all.
You're beautiful. The most beautiful person I've ever seen.
Thank you, Zack. I wanted to be with you.
Emily dies, and Zack has a vision of her off in the woods, with the rest of the victims, as well as York, who's finally ready to leave, since he believes Zack is ready to stand up for himself. Freshly empowered, Zack battles Kaysen in the other world, wounding him grievously. Then Kaysen transforms into a horrible beast and chases Zack deeper into the other world, first down a seemingly endless staircase, before they end up in a demonic version of a bell tower for their final battle. Zack finally defeats Kaysen by attacking the doll version of him that serves as a link between the other world and Earth, which finally forces Kaysen to reveal his true form, a demonic eye contained within a horrible mouth. Zack shoots it and Kaysen is finally killed. Which has the immediate effect of breaking the spell of madness that had been cast on the people of Greenvale. They immediately stop fighting one another and look around, puzzled by what caused them to act so violently.
Emily, York tries not to show it, but he's pretty shy. Don't wait for him to propose. Just ask him to marry you.
Zack returns to the stage and collects Emily's body. On the way out of the building, he sees the small doll of Kaysen lying on the floorboards. He steps on it on his way off the stage and discovers that all along, it was a squeaky dog toy. The next day, Zack goes to visit Harry and talk over the final details of the case. Harry reveals that he was George's father and blames himself for causing all of this tragedy by failing to protect his son from his insane wife.
I wanted to save George, too, if I could. Everything was my fault. If only I had the courage to make the right decision, Emily and the other girls would not have died. But you have put an end to all of that.
On his way out of town, Zack spots the red dress version of Emily off in the woods and chases after her. He finds Jim and the twins out in the woods. The twins get a message from Emily's spirit.
Emily kind of told us to give this to you.
Emily said it's a present for Zack.
Thank you. Where did you get this?
Emily asked us to give it to you. See? She's over there.
There's another Zack there too. You're twins, just like us.
Emily couldn't give it to you herself. She said she's too embarrassed. So, she asked us to hand it to you.
Who gives them her precious gold leaf necklace to hand over to Zack. He takes it and bids farewell to Emily, York, and all of the goddesses of the forest. With the case closed, Zack leaves town after learning one final piece of haunting information. In the cupboard behind the reception desk in the hotel is a picture from when the clock tower was completed, in which a 20-something Polly is standing just a few feet away from Kaysen, who looks exactly the same as he did 50 years earlier. This suggests that Polly must have had some inkling of what was going on in town. Then, as Zack leaves town, we get a final look at Willie, who has retrieved the doll version of Kaysen from the theater, suggesting that he's not quite done with Zack yet.
So, that's the story of Deadly Premonition, but not all of it. This explanation of the plot only scratches the surface of the characters and events that fill the town of Greenville, like no other video game setting before or since. So please, join us back here as we explore them all.